Welcome to Desert Wanderers, produced by Salt and Light Radio. If you're new here, we bridge the gap between you and the person in the pew next to you. We have something new for you for the next couple of weeks with Dr. David Lamy. He is going to be producing a series of talks that will discuss the intersection of science and faith. He'll go over questions of the origin of the universe and genetic code and what God has to do with all of that. With this being said, if you've ever pondered the mysteries of life itself or the origin of the universe, go ahead and stay tuned for this episode. We hope you like it.
Everyone, my name is Dave Lamy. I'm a physician and self-admitted science nerd. And I've developed a personal interest in studying the intersection of science and faith. This is the second discussion I've put together on the intersection of science and faith, and today I'm going to discuss the historical relationship between science and faith. There's a wide perception in our society that science and faith have always been in conflict, and a belief that dogmatic theology, particularly Christianity, has hindered scientific advancement. So today I'm going to discuss the role Christianity actually played in getting the scientific revolution going, and then I'll go on to explain what happened in the 19th century that drove a wedge between science and faith and gives us the perception now that they've always been in conflict. This belief that they've always been in conflict has been termed the conflict thesis or the warfare thesis. Finally, I will discuss the role of the Catholic Church, the often misunderstood role of the Catholic Church as it relates to scientific advancement. Let me first review what we mean by science. Science really is just a tool to help us explore and try to understand the world around us, the physical or the material world, things in nature, essentially anything made of matter and energy. The term scientist wasn't even used until the middle of the 19th century. Prior to that, people undertaking science were called natural philosophers. And this goes back now thousands of years where people have been making attempts to understand the world around them. But science really didn't take off in a major way until what we call the scientific revolution, which began about 500 years ago and occurred during the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. The scientists leading that scientific revolution were virtually all very faithful Christians. And so the question becomes, why did the scientific revolution occur in Europe among Christians at that time? You're familiar with many of the names of the people who led the scientific revolution. Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo were Catholic. Johannes Kepler was a Lutheran. Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton were Anglican, and these were all very faithful Christians. Let's first think about what it takes to do science. You need a civilization that is advanced enough to allow certain members of your population the luxury of undertaking intellectual pursuits. It doesn't do your population much good to have people doing science if everyone's worried about surviving and finding their next meal. Secondly, you need some basic technologies, technology that allows you to do experiments, to collect samples of things, to take apart things or dissect organisms. Next, you need a written language, a way to record your findings and hopefully then communicate those to other people who will take what you've discovered and try to expand on that. And finally, you need some basic math skills, some ability to analyze data and come to conclusions about it. These basic requirements to do science have existed for probably 5,000 years in various human civilizations. The first written language was in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. And in fact, many civilizations in human history have made scientific discoveries and technological advancements. You can think of the Romans and their ability to build complex roads and bridges, aqueducts, colosseums based on engineering principles. Certainly the Greeks gave us all kinds of knowledge in many things, including natural philosophy. the Egyptians and the construction of the pyramids based on some mathematical and engineering properties. The Persians that gave us lenses and contributed in many ways to mathematics. And the Chinese who discovered gunpowder, which clearly altered the course of human history in many ways. And yet, a rapid advance in science did not occur until the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. And so the question is, why then and why there? What historians of science and philosophers of science generally feel led to the scientific revolution was a change in mindset, a change in worldview. It was a reaffirmation of the Judeo-Christian belief in the doctrine of creation. I'll explain that more here in a moment. Prior civilizations capable of doing science, many of those were polytheistic civilizations. And in polytheism, there's generally not a belief that nature is orderly. They feel it's very unpredictable. They believe that nature is at the whims of the gods, and particularly if gods are in conflict with each other, there's even more instability in nature. And therefore, they didn't really feel that we had the capability of understanding nature. The ancient Greeks, many of them differed in this regard, particularly Aristotle. They believed that nature was orderly and comprehensible to us, but they did not believe in a divine creator of the world. They believed that the world itself had always existed, and that the order in nature came from an intrinsic self-existent property of nature that they termed the logos. Therefore, they believed that simply by thinking through logic and reason about nature, they could understand it. For example, they thought that the sun, the moon, and the planets should all be perfect spheres with perfectly smooth surfaces and should follow perfectly circular orbits because this was the simplest and most logical way things should be. Let's go back now to the doctrine of creation. Why was there a reaffirmation of this leading to the scientific revolution? Well, in the 11th and 12th centuries, many of Aristotle's extensive writings were translated into Latin, where more scholars could read these and learn about these. And this led to a new philosophical and theological movement known as scholasticism. Scholasticism is the attempt to take Aristotelian logic and reason and combine it with theology. At the same time, the first universities were opening up in Europe, providing further education to more and more people. Next comes the advent of the printing press in the 1440s. And many of the first books that were mass-produced were religious books, the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, but also much of the literature and writings from the classical time in Rome and Greece were also produced. Lastly, there was the Protestant Reformation, which emphasized the Bible and Scripture, and this led to both Catholics and Protestants really re-examining what Scripture has to say. So then there was this reaffirmation of the doctrine of creation. So what is the doctrine of creation? This is the belief that the world is not eternal, that God created the world out of his mind, out of his will, and out of his love. It's a belief that God himself is eternal and self-existent, and a belief that he created the world as good. He created man in his image and likeness and gave us a special place in his creation with an intelligence capable of understanding his creation. But because God made creation out of his mind, he was free to make it in any way he wanted. Therefore, it was not good enough to simply use logic and reason to try to understand what was happening in nature. We actually had to go out and observe it in order to understand it. In addition to this, there was a reaffirmation on what's called the doctrine of original sin, the belief that God created the world as good, but that man was fallen. And because of original sin, the belief was that man was very capable of deceiving ourselves, and certainly we all know that to be true. Therefore, this worked into what we call the scientific method, the technique of doing science in which we use data with statistical analysis to, as much as possible, reduce human bias and limit our ability to deceive ourselves. So clearly during the scientific revolution, there was not a conflict between science and faith, and in fact quite the opposite. Those scientists were highly motivated because of their faith to do science. They believed that the more they understood science, perhaps the better they would understand the mind of God. Johannes Kepler, one of the leaders of the scientific revolution and a German astronomer, said that the pursuit of science and the pursuit of God are intertwined pursuits. Galileo echoed the thoughts of many of the earlier church fathers who said that God wrote two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, and understanding both would give us a better understanding of the mind of God. Okay, so what changed that led us to this apparent conflict that exists today between science and faith? It all began to unravel really in the 19th century with the belief that the very existence of matter itself and the various laws of physics and chemistry and biology acting on that matter could ultimately lead through natural, unguided processes to everything we see around us today. Some examples. Charles Laplace was a French mathematician who was able to explain the origin of our solar system simply through the law of gravity. Charles Lyell, an English geologist, was able to explain the unique features of the Earth's surface that previously had been attributed to the works of God. He was able to explain them through natural processes of tectonic plate changes, volcanoes, etc. And most importantly of all was Charles Darwin, who came up with his theory of evolution, published in 1859, which gave a theory as to all biological origins, beginning from a very simple living organism to the multiple complex forms of life that exist today, including human beings. When all of these, what we call origin theories or origin discoveries, are combined with the view at the time that the universe was eternal, that matter and energy themselves had always existed, this led many scientists by the end of the 19th century to believe that everything was going to be explainable through natural processes and through science, and that there was no longer a need to invoke a divine being to explain things. There was one other factor in the 19th century that helped drive a wedge between science and faith, and that was the Enlightenment philosophy. Enlightenment philosophy is generally the belief that you should base your thinking on logic, reason, science, evidence, and it argues for individualism. It argues for rejecting superstition and religious dogma. Now, Enlightenment philosophy is not per se anti-religious, but it does argue that religion should be an individual pursuit and that the government should stay out of religion. So when you then combine Enlightenment philosophy with the prevailing belief that the universe was eternal and that matter had always existed, and combine that with these origin theories and discoveries of the 19th century, You then enter the 20th century with a large number of scientists being atheists. Now, certainly not all scientists in the 20th century were atheists, but the ones who maintained faith, some of them felt that science and faith are completely non-overlapping pursuits, and they thought about them as completely separate and unrelated things. Finally, there were two well-read books published by American authors in the late 19th century which really cemented this conflict or warfare thesis. The first was by John William Draper, published in 1874, entitled History of Conflict Between Religion and Science. And the second was by Andrew Dixon White, published in 1896, entitled A History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom. So, this warfare or conflict thesis is also sometimes referred to as the Draper-White thesis, based on these two authors. Draper wrote, Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. One must yield to the other. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. These books were in many ways revisionist history and were entirely inaccurate in portraying the role of Christianity in the scientific revolution. But nevertheless, it's this conflict thesis which has now come into the 20th and now the 21st centuries and really dominates much of our scientific community and many of our academic institutions. Now, you're probably aware that even in the past 20 years, there has been an increased number of non-believers in the Western world. Bishop Robert Barron often refers to these as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religious affiliation. And I believe this increase we've seen in the past 20 years is primarily due to the success of something that was called the New Atheist movement that began 20 years ago. Probably the most famous person involved with the New Atheist movement was Richard Dawkins, a British biologist who wrote a best-selling book in 2006 called The God Delusion. Some of the other proponents in the New Atheist movement include Sam Harris, a neuroscientist, Christopher Hitchens, a journalist, and Daniel Dennett, a philosopher and cognitive scientist. These people were pretty effective in getting out their message about atheism. They didn't really use new arguments arguing for atheism, but they were successful for several reasons. Each one of them is fairly well recognized within their respective fields, so they have credibility. They were also effective in using the new media, particularly social media, to get their message out. And their message was presented oftentimes in very provocative ways. And we understand how provocation is pretty effective with new media in getting people to pay attention. Finally, they were delivering their message at a time where the Western world is somewhat sensitive to at least religious extremism based on 9/11 and based on other terrorist activities. That brings us to where we are today, a world in which many believe science and faith are in conflict with each other. But it should not be that way, and it certainly has not always been that way. You now, I hope, understand the very important role Judeo-Christian belief played in the advancement of science. My personal belief is that we seek truth through science, and we also seek truth through theology. And many times, these are trying to answer separate questions that don't overlap. But sometimes they try to answer questions that do overlap, and at times, the answers we get from science and theology are in conflict with each other. When this occurs, I believe that both the science and the theology need to be re-examined, investigated further, and ultimately reconciled. Next, I'd like to talk about the role of the Catholic Church in science and the widespread belief that the Church has been against science and has hindered scientific progress. The first thing I want to discuss is what happened during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages began with the fall of the last Roman emperor in the year 476 and extended for about the next 1,000 years until the end of the 15th century. During that time, there were some technological and scientific advancements made, things like the mechanical clock, a windmill, watermill, certainly agricultural advancements. But to be fair, it is reasonable to believe that much more advancements in science and human achievement could have occurred over those 1,000 years. Now, the Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages, and this term is really a pejorative meant to indicate that the Church was responsible for limiting any human achievement during that time. The relative reduced human achievement over the Middle Ages was not due to the Church. It was really due to the development of the feudal system of living in Europe through the Middle Ages. Anyone who's traveled in Europe has visited medieval towns which were often put on hilltops surrounded by large walls for security. There was ongoing conflicts between these small populations of people, whereas during the Roman Empire, there was a large central authority trying to keep peace and order, although often conquering its neighbors. With the feudal system, there was a breakdown in many ways in travel and trade, and with reduced travel and trade, there's certainly a reduced exchange of knowledge and ideas. In addition, the nearly constant conflicts that were occurring forced many people again to go back and focus their attention on survival. So what was the Church doing as it pertains to science and knowledge during the Middle Ages? For one, it was busy copying and translating the ancient knowledge gained, particularly from the Greek scholars. This information likely would have been lost to history were it not for the monasteries throughout Europe, and these monasteries contained rooms known as scriptoriums, where all of these ancient records were being copied and translated and disseminated in Europe. Secondly, there was not a lot of formal education in Europe during the Middle Ages, but what education was available was essentially all available through the Church and attached to either monasteries or attached to cathedrals throughout Europe. And the Church was then very supportive and instrumental in beginning the first universities in the 11th and 12th centuries. The first university in Europe was the University of Bologna, I believe in the year 1086, and this was followed by universities at Oxford, Salamanca, Paris, and Cambridge. And all of this was dramatically supported and encouraged by the Church. Finally, it was the theologians in the Church who began the whole scholastic movement in the 11th and 12th centuries, combining classic Greek philosophy and logic with theology. The second myth that I want to talk about as it pertains to the Catholic Church is the flat earth myth. If you're like me when you were young, you were led to believe that many people in the Middle Ages thought that the earth was flat, and When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492 to try to find a new trade route to the Far East, I was led to believe that many Europeans thought he was crazy because he was likely going to fall off the face of the earth. Well, the truth is, virtually nobody in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. In fact, we may have more flat earthers today than they did back then. The knowledge that the earth was round was known in ancient Greece many years BC. And the astronomers discovered this because of lunar eclipses, which show the shadow of the earth on the moon during the eclipse, and also because astronomers mapping the night sky would get an entirely different map when they travel north or south, and the change in the map could only be explained if they were traveling along a curved Earth's surface versus a flat Earth's surface. This myth that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat comes directly out of that book I mentioned earlier by John William Draper, published in 1876. Okay, now let's talk about the by far most common story that's told as evidence that the Catholic Church has been anti-science, and that is the story of the trial of Galileo. This, of course, did not occur during the Middle Ages. This occurred during the middle of the scientific revolution. But the story is often told in society is that Galileo used his telescope to prove that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the sun revolving around the earth, and that the Catholic Church was dogmatic in its belief that the earth was the center of the universe, and therefore they put him on trial, convicted him of heresy, and sent him to prison, and some stories even report that he was tortured. The truth is far more complicated than that, and I'm going to have to use a little bit of science, a little bit of nerdy explanation to be able to paint the picture of what the true story is, because the true story is actually very complicated and very nuanced. For many centuries, people did believe that the earth was the center of the universe, and this came from several sources. In Scripture, there are several passages which are not specific, but seem to indicate that the earth may lie at the center of the universe. Secondly, the Greek philosophers did believe, just based on logic and reason, that we were at the center of the universe. And they also said this in part because we have no sensation that the earth is in motion. Now, anybody who studied any physics at the high school level knows that motion is always relative. You can't talk about motion of an isolated object. You always have to talk about motion of one object relative to another. For example, we now know as we orbit the sun that the Earth itself is traveling through space at approximately 67,000 miles per hour, and yet we have no sensation of that whatsoever as we sit here on the Earth's surface. Finally, astronomers looking up at the night sky failed to reveal a phenomenon known as parallax. Parallax is the perception as you're moving that things close to you are moving past you faster than things further away from you. They looked for parallax by looking up at the stars and did not see it, and therefore concluded that the earth was not in motion. So based on theology, based on philosophy, and to some extent based on science, people thought the earth was not in motion and that the sun, the moon, and the planets revolved around the earth. Next came a Greek-Egyptian astronomer in the middle of the 2nd century AD named Claudius Ptolemy. Ptolemy took the astronomy observations of other astronomers and the map of the planets, the moon, and the sun as they progress across our sky. And he applied mathematical equations to these, and this allowed people to predict where these various things may be at any point in the future. However, even during the time of Ptolemy, astronomers had already noticed something peculiar about the orbit of some of the planets, notably Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. What they found is these planets, as they come up and orbit what they believed was orbiting the Earth, they would temporarily go in a backwards motion before progressing further. And so his model essentially had those planets orbiting but doing little circles as they orbit, and he called these things epicycles, and he actually applied mathematical equations to describe these. Well, the Ptolemy model of the universe, the Earth-centered model of the universe, really persisted over the next several hundred years till the scientific revolution. There were a couple of less-known Greek philosophers who had come up with a theory that the sun was at the center of the universe, but that really didn't gain much attention. Next then came Nicholas Copernicus. In the early part of the scientific revolution, in the early part of the 16th century, he was a Polish astronomer who didn't really make many new observations of his own, but he took the previous astronomy observations and felt that they would be better explained by a sun-centered model rather than an earth-centered model. He felt that the mathematical equations were much simpler in a sun-centered model. He was a devout Catholic, and he did publish his theory of the sun-centered universe in 1543. Now, that was the same year he died, so we never really saw how it was received by the church at the time. Next comes a Danish astronomer named Tycho Brahe, who comes up with a different model to explain the observations of the orbits. He comes up with a model that still has the Earth at the center of the universe, but has the planets orbiting the sun, and the sun itself with its orbiting planets now orbiting the Earth. This model actually fit the astronomy observations fairly accurately. And so at this point, really at the end of the 16th century, there are three competing models of the orientation of the universe. The Ptolemaic model with the Earth at the center, the Taconic model from Tycho Brahe with still the Earth at the center but the sun and planets revolving around it, and then the Copernican model. And astronomers are fairly divided over which of these models they think is the correct one. With the three models being discussed and debated among astronomers, along comes Galileo. The first telescope was invented by a Dutch optician in 1608, and in 1609, Galileo builds himself a telescope and starts making observations. Galileo was never able to conclusively prove that the sun is the center of our solar system. At the time, they believed that was the center of the universe. But he does make some observations that argue against the Ptolemaic model. What he sees with his telescope is that there are moons, 4 moons revolving around Jupiter, and this goes against the Ptolemaic model that everything's supposed to revolve around the Earth. And he also sees that there are phases in Venus, much like our moon goes through phases. And the phases of Venus could be best explained by Venus orbiting around the sun. So he does have evidence that seems to refute the Ptolemaic model, but he does not yet have conclusive evidence that the sun is the center of the solar system. Now, Galileo has a very good relationship with Pope Urban VIII, and he approaches the Pope and asks him for permission to publish his theory in support of the Copernican model. Galileo, again, does not have proof that that model is correct. In fact, he made some mistakes. For example, he thought that the activity of the tides in our oceans, rising and falling, was evidence that the earth itself was in motion, much like carrying a bucket full of water and the water sloshing back and forth. The conclusive proof of the sun-centered solar system really came after Galileo was alive. Sir Isaac Newton contributed to the theory in a big way with his discovery of gravity later in the 17th century. But some astronomers remained skeptical until parallax was finally discovered in the early 19th century, proving that, in fact, the Earth was in motion. So Galileo approaches the Pope and asks for his permission to publish his theory. And the Pope gives him permission with the caveat that he clearly explained this is not yet settled science. There's still debate over which model is correct. This is where Galileo lets his self-confidence perhaps get the best of him. He publishes his theory in a book format in 1632. And he does it in a format called a Socratic dialogue. This is essentially a story with fictional characters discussing and debating a topic. In his book, he uses three characters. One character is arguing for the Ptolemaic Earth-centered model. One character is arguing for the Copernican model. No one is really arguing for the Tychonic model. And the third character is really the educated arbiter of the debate who ultimately sides with the character arguing for the Copernican model. Now, the name given to the character arguing for the Ptolemaic model, the Earth-centered model, was Simplicio. In Latin, Simplicio means simple-minded. And Simplicio said things and had attributes that made many people think that this was representing the Pope himself. In other words, it really appeared that Galileo was making fun of and in some ways belittling the Pope. Well, in the United States today, it's perfectly fine for us to make fun and belittle our leaders. In fact, it's virtually a competitive sport. But that is not okay even today in much of the world. And it certainly was not okay 400 years ago in Europe. So this upset the Pope and other church authorities. And in fact, in the publication that Galileo had, he really didn't present it as an open for debate topic. He presented it as if it was settled science. So the church brought him in under charges of heresy, and he did undergo trial. Ultimately, he was convicted for a lesser charge. The charge was vehemently suspect of heresy. And his sentence was house arrest, where he returned to his home in Tuscany and spent the last 9 years of his life continuing his studies and his scientific endeavors. He was never imprisoned. In fact, during his trial, he lived in the Tuscan embassy in Rome. And so the reports of him being imprisoned or tortured are clearly not correct. Now, the church certainly didn't handle it well and deserves criticism, particularly with the mindset we have today that it's perfectly reasonable to make fun of our leaders. But Galileo also deserves some criticism for really letting his ego get in his way and in how he handled the whole situation. So was the Catholic Church anti-science during the Galileo affair? They really weren't. They were certainly open to scientific discoveries. The Catholic theologians understand that the Bible itself is many books written in many different genres, and the Bible itself is seen as truth, but not always as literal scientific or literal historical truth. It requires interpretation based on the genre that each book is written in, and also an understanding of the time and place in which the scriptures were produced. Coming out of what was called the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century, the church had made the decision that it would accept and even change its interpretation of Scripture if science could conclusively prove something that conflicted with their theology. I will conclude here. I apologize for going deep in the weeds in certain parts of this talk, but it reflects my fascination with science and my determination to try to understand some complicated issues. Hopefully you have a much better appreciation for what Christianity and Judeo-Christian beliefs played in the scientific revolution, and I hope you now understand better why there's this loud message in society that faith and science are in conflict. That message is false. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Desert Wanderers. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up as well as subscribe down below. We're produced by Salt and Light Radio, so you can find us on social platforms at Salt and Light Radio or Desert Wanderers Podcast. We produce episodes every week and we launch them for you on Wednesdays, so make sure to tune in for next week's episode and we'll see you then.